Thank you very much for coming. And I really would like to thank Professor Mercer to give us a lecture. First, I would like to introduce my best friend, Professor Mercer. Dr. Mercer is a professor in the Department of Kinesiology and Nutrition Sciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in the United States. Dr. Mercer's research emphasis is on human locomotion and sports performance. In particular, Dr. Mercer has a focused line of research on biomechanical and physiological responses during running to understand factors that drive running style, influence performance, and minimize risk of overuse injury. For example, he has explored physiological and biomechanical factors while running with body weight support, different physiological status such as fatigue, speed, styles, hook strike patterns, shoes, as well as in running in the water. He also has conducted research on biomechanical and physiological responses during cycling, playing lacrosse, and simulated swimming, and for example. Dr. Mercer earned his Bachelor BS from Buffalo State College of New York, his MS from University of North Texas, and his PhD from the University of Oregon. He is a past president of the Southwest chapter of the American College of Sports Medicine. Dr. Mercer is the chair of the Biomedical Institutional Review Board, as well as the chair of the University Research Council. As an active endurance athlete, he is world-class top triathlete. He is now competing still. It's amazing. Dr. Mercer is very engaged with the community as a participant in endurance events, as well as providing educational and research opportunities for community members to be part of. Again, I truly appreciate this wonderful chance. Thank you very much for accepting my request to give us a lecture. Thank you very much. And please welcome Professor Mercer.
ありがとうございました。私は岡井友達。Big friend?
Yeah.
You are my big friend. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you.
Was that close?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. It's always a pleasure to come and talk with Dr. Matsumoto, who is an expert in body weight support research, and we've had the pleasure of collaborating now for well over a decade, and it's been fantastic. And so I really enjoy coming to Japan and talking with you folks, the students, and hopefully I can share with you a little bit about what I do, what we've done, and maybe that relates back to some of the things that you're doing. So as Dr. Matsumoto said, I did my undergraduate work in Buffalo State in New York, then I went down to Texas, and went to Oregon, and now I'm at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and it's been an interesting academic career, but I'll tell you that I really enjoy asking questions. And throughout my entire educational career and academic career, I enjoy asking questions. And the questions that I ask range from applied questions. I'm interested in trying to find things that will help me, to theoretical questions. Why do we run the way we run? And it may not actually have an application. So what I thought I would talk with you about today is how to take some of the research that we've done and apply it back to helping something. In this case, I'm interested in helping understand human performance. And so what I'm going to do is talk about research that we've done and then turn it around to try to help me be a better triathlete. Why triathlete? Because that's my history. That's where I competed in swimming in college, and it's the reason why I went for my master's degree, is because I wanted to be able to go faster. So I wanted to find out some of the science behind human movement, and that led me on to working in a cardiac rehabilitation program, and I was interested in trying to help people with heart conditions become healthy again, and so that actually drove me on to go into my PhD work. And so my career has been built around trying to ask questions that ultimately I have an interest in answering. And so I've got this model here of applied research where I find it's very important to find things that you find interesting and then to start exploring them. And when you find things that are interesting to you, you start asking questions. Why do we run the way we run? How do I run faster? How do I bike faster? How do I swim faster? Whatever it may be in terms of your interest. And when we ask questions, we try to put down answers to those questions. What do you think the answer is? Why do you think you run a particular way? Why? What factors do you think influence performance? And when you start asking questions, you start trying to come up with a way to measure certain things, and we call that empirical evidence. We conduct experiments, and when we've measured things, we then analyze our measurements, and then we look and see were we right? Was our answer correct? Or was our answer incorrect? And regardless of whether or not we are right or wrong in our answer, we start asking more questions. So this circle of experiments, or circle of inquiry, this circle of trying to understand things, is this process of, one, finding a topic you find interesting, asking questions, start putting down answers, start doing measurements, analyzing those measurements, figuring out whether or not you're right or wrong, and then asking new questions or modifying your question in some way. So I call this an applied research because I'm trying to find answers to things that I find interesting. And I'm trying to find answers that ultimately are useful in the context of human performance. So how do I swim faster? How do I bike faster? How do I run faster? So something I find also really important, not only finding something of interest and starting to ask questions, but knowing terminology. I think knowing terminology and getting terminology down is incredibly important for collaborating and talking with people, or figuring out a way to share your research with somebody else. It's important to have common terms. So often Dr. Matsumoto and I will be talking about something, and sometimes we have to stop and say, wait, how are you defining this concept? And once we settle on a definition, then we can continue to share our ideas with each other. But if we don't have a common terminology, it's hard to share ideas. So these are terms that I'll use today in this presentation. I use biomechanics. My training in education is largely in biomechanics, where we use mechanical principles to understand human movement, or we use physics to understand sport. Physiology is another term I'll use, and that's the science of the functions of living organisms and its components, and of the chemical and physical processes involved. Exercise physiology is where we start applying physiology to before, during, and after exercise. So basic and applied science that describes, explains, and uses the body's response to exercise and adaptation to exercise training to maximize human physical potential. I'll also talk about endurance, because I'm interested in endurance performance, and that's the ability to sustain a prolonged and stressful effort. And then performance, which again, is, we've talked about human performance, or we've used that term a few times, it's how well we do something. So So human performance is how well we do something. If we start looking at endurance performance, it's how well we do endurance, so marathon, an Ironman, something of long sustained effort. And we will start, and I will talk about looking at the exercise physiology of endurance performance, as well as the biomechanics of endurance performance. All right, so that's some context, and these are just some pictures that go along with each of those areas. So I'm interested in using a research model to understand human performance. So why research? Why is that important, and what are the rules behind conducting good research? Well, this is just, again, some definitions, getting terminology down. When we use the term research, we mean to investigate thoroughly, careful, diligent search, studious inquiry or an examination, especially investigation or experimentation, aimed at discovery and interpretation of facts, theories, laws, and the collecting of information about a particular subject. So all those descriptors are describing research. What I'm interested in, and when I work with students at UNLV, I teach them about the scientific method to conduct research. And the scientific method is a very systematic approach to trying to understand something. That involves some logical approaches to understanding a particular problem. Our procedures make sense. The conclusions that we make are tied to our empirical data, the measurements we've made. It's reductive in a general sense. It establishes good relationships between different parameters. And the research is replicable. That means if I do an experiment in Las Vegas, I share those data and the experiment with Dr. Matsumoto. He can conduct the same experiment here in Fukuoka and get the same results, that they're repeated not only by me, but by others. So scientific method is described basically as this type of model. We start with lots of observations. We ask a lot of questions. We start forming hypotheses. And a hypothesis is just a statement we believe to be true based upon what we know. That's all a hypothesis is. Now, if you're taking statistics, you have null hypothesis, you have alternative hypotheses, and what have you. But from a description of research, a hypothesis is simply a statement we believe to be true based upon what we know. We conduct experiments, and our experiments are designed to challenge the ideas that we have. So we take a very negative approach with research in that we actually try to design experiments to disprove our ideas, or to prove that we're wrong, or to show that we're wrong. And when we start doing that process, and we do an experiment, if we can't disprove our hypothesis, then we move on and we challenge that hypothesis through another experiment. And by constantly and consistently doing research in that manner, we will eventually come to an understanding on some answers that are supported through research. We do an analysis, we make conclusions based upon our empirical data, and what we try to be careful of in this scientific method is to separate anecdotes from empirical information. Anecdotes are stories. I ran faster because I wore a pair of shoes. That's a story. That's not empirical. Empirical would mean that we would test out the effectiveness of different styles of shoes on performance. The anecdotes are important. They're important because they are stories that often lead us to ask good questions, especially in the applied world. So if we listen to the anecdotes that are happening, we can craft some questions and ultimately design some experiments to test out different hypotheses. Okay, unscientific methods of problem solving, or unscientific methods of answering questions, are tenacity. So it's superstitions, it's myths. There's no real logic. In the sports world, an example of tenacity would be you need to put your left sock on before your right sock, and I'll be able to run faster. Because the last time I did that, I was able to run faster. Intuition common sense. We often rely on common sense to come up with our initial answers to questions, but we often have to make sure that we are challenging our intuition through experiment. Authority is an unscientific way to answer questions. That would mean, even though I've done a lot of research on a particular topic, I've got to be careful where I can't say, here's what the answer is based upon me as an authority. It's important to continue to question even those of us who have been doing research for some time. And rationalistic, where we start rationalizing things that do not actually connect with each other. So for example, all basketball players are tall. Tom is a basketball player, therefore Tom is tall. That's a rationalistic way to answer a particular question, but it's not true because not all basketball players are tall. So what I'm interested in doing, and what I'm going to talk about with you today, is applying the research that I've worked on to understand endurance performance. So we're going to take all these aspects of scientific method and I'm going to apply it to triathlon. Why triathlon? Well, because that's how I got started in this academic career. I completed my undergraduate degree at Buffalo. I swam competitively at Buffalo, and after that I started competing in triathlons, and that took me down the path of trying to want more information about how to go faster in triathlon. So now that I'm in a position of conducting research, the questions I have relate back to this sport. So, have any of you done a triathlon? So let me explain what a triathlon is. This is just a quick video of triathlon. This is Hawaii Ironman, Kona, and in an iron distance event, you have to swim 2.4 miles, so 4,000 meters. Then you bike 112 miles, which would be 180 kilometers. And then you need to run a marathon, 26.2 miles or 42.2 kilometers. You do that all in one day. The best triathletes, the professional triathletes, will do this in about 8 hours for men, and anywhere between 8 and 8:30, 8 hours and 30 minutes for females. That's for the professionals. For the mere mortals, the rest of us, we may take 10 hours. We may take 12 hours. The longest that you can have to complete an Ironman race, an iron distance race, is dictated by the course, but typically the cutoff time is 17 hours. So people are often exercising for 17 continuous hours to complete those distances. And there's a lot that goes in to training for an event. My last Ironman was just 4 weeks ago. I did Arizona, and went back and watched the people who were finishing around 16 to 17 hours. And it is amazing to see some people crawl across the finish line because they are really motivated to complete the event. So as we talk about research, I want to keep this in mind, because this is why I'm doing research. I'm trying to ask questions, and then I'm trying to come back and apply it to how do you finish, how do you complete an iron distance event in as short of a period of time as possible. And you can see how happy these people are when they finish, because they've been exercising for 12 hours continuously or what have you. All different types of people do these events. There's a person with prosthetic limbs, all different sizes, all different shapes, all different ages. The oldest competitor is typically around 80 years old doing an event like this. And so I find it interesting Now, I did my first triathlon back in 1985. Triathlons come in all different distances, and some of them take less than an hour to compete, some take about 2 hours to compete. Iron distance events, as I said, can take anywhere from 8 hours to 17 hours. My first Ironman was actually Ironman Japan, where I came to visit Dr. Matsumoto, and I went down to Fukui Island and go to Nagasaki, and was able to complete the event on that island, and it was a fabulous experience. And not only do Dr. Matsumoto and I continue to have a good friendship, but I actually met people during that event, and I still stay in touch with them because it was a neat event. But now we want to start asking questions. Why do people do these events? Again, they take 18 to 17 hours. What equipment is needed? Well, in the swim, you can wear a wetsuit. That's an important piece of equipment to start asking questions about. What's the best type of wetsuit? Bike frame. Well, bike. Well, you need, obviously, the frame, the wheels, and the tires. Well, you are actually, the bike makes up the largest time component of the event. So it makes sense to look at some of the equipment that's needed to do the bike, and how to get a bike that would be the fastest, or allow you to go as fast as possible over the 112, 180 kilometer distance. And if we're looking at running, the obvious piece of equipment to analyze there is the running shoes. And we'll talk about that. We also want to know how to pace an event like this. How do you exercise continuously for 12 hours? What type of pace do you need to be able to sustain that period of time? And what I'll talk with you about is looking at core temperature and how that might influence your performance. And then clearly, a big part of being able to do these events is nutrition. What you eat before, during, and even after an event like this. And there's a lot more questions, so I just put ... all sorts of questions that you can ask regarding these events. When you do start asking these questions, you start coming up with lots of different answers. Biomechanics, macronutrients, drag force, glycogen resistance, buoyancy force, triglycerides. There's a lot of things that go into what influences iron distance performance or endurance performance. What I want to do, and what I try to do, when I have lots of different things that are influencing something, I try to organize them in a particular way so I can start designing experiments to test out different components that influence performance. So I'll use the model like this to explain pretty much any human performance, but let me go through this a little bit. Up here on top, I have chemical energy, where our bodies are built with a lot of chemical energy. The food that we eat is chemical energy. Energy is the capacity to do work. Work is simply applying a force over some distance. So we have chemical energy available, and what our body does, our physiological processes, we transform that chemical energy to mechanical energy. Mechanical energy is movement. Okay, mechanical energy is movement. Chemical energy is the state of energy that we have, and we want to convert that energy aerobically with the use of oxygen, or anaerobically without the need for oxygen. So that's our aerobic processes to generate ATP. Once we have ATP and adenosine triphosphate, we can have cross-bridge formation, and we have muscle shortening. Muscle shortening is going to cause joint movement, flexions, extensions, rotations, what have you, and ultimately we have movements. So here we have aerobic and anaerobic processes to convert energy. This process is not 100% efficient. In fact, if we have 100 units of chemical energy, we probably only generate about 30 units of mechanical energy. The rest of that energy is typically lost as heat. And sometimes we want to retain that heat to stay warm, or we want to get rid of that heat if we're exercising in a hot environment. And so that thermoregulation process is really important in terms of endurance performance. Under chemical energy, we have fuels, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins to some extent. We have storage of fuel, fats, we have the adipose tissue, we have free fatty acids that are circulating in the bloodstream, we have triglycerides, these are all fats. We have carbohydrates in the muscle, we have carbohydrates in the liver, and we have carbohydrates in the blood, in the form of blood glucose. And this interplay of carbohydrate between the liver delivering glycogen, glucose to the blood, and the blood delivering the glucose to the muscle, this interplay is something I'm really interested in. I'm going to actually show you some data on what happens to glucose, blood glucose during the course of an Ironman event. And under chemical energy, we need to be concerned about fuel intake before, during, and after an event in order to complete the event in the required time. Under the conversion of chemical energy to mechanical energy, that aerobic and anaerobic processes, when we start focusing on that part of this model, well, now we're talking about training, how we train somebody. We look at frequency, intensity, time, and mode or type of exercise in order to stress the aerobic system or anaerobic system, and then have that system respond to get a training response. We have to monitor training. We often typically do that through heart rate. Maybe we measure power, that's very common in cycling, or we look at rating of perceived exertion, or maybe even blood lactate levels. These are all important metrics to monitor how well we are training and what intensity to train at in order to get our bodies to respond in a particular way to improve human performance. And as I mentioned, thermal regulation, this process of converting energy from one form to another is not 100% efficient, and so we are generating a lot of heat in this process, and we either want to get rid of that heat, which we do via sweating, or we want to retain that heat. Maybe we have to wear certain types of clothing to be able to capture that heat so we stay warm, especially on a cold day like today, being able to retain that heat. Under mechanical energy, this is the movement part. We're generating force, a particular magnitude of force applied in a particular direction, and we have coordination. So as we start doing movements, we know that we fire some muscles, relax others, and then we fire those muscles. We have this coordination that's going on during human movement, and that coordination is very important, coordination. And that's typically why we do movements, or do we do drills in practice. We typically are trying to teach ourselves a particular coordination to be able to swim better, be able to run better, or be able to bike better. So technique becomes very important. So we are not as inefficient in our movements. And a lot of times when we're looking at human performance, we often want to reduce our resistance forces. And I'll talk about that, especially in cycling and swimming. We want as little resistance to moving forward, so that whatever propulsion force we can generate will allow us to go faster. I've got injury down here at the bottom because injury, when we start doing too much movement, too fast, or doing too much change, we ultimately can have an injury, and we have to deal with that injury because that injury ultimately influences human performance. All right, so again, we're going to apply this to swim, bike, and run. And these are just different areas of research that I've touched on through my career, looking at what happens to physiology before a race, during the swim, during transitioning from the swim to the bike, what happens during the bike, what happens during the run. I, oddly enough, have not done any research on what happens between the transition between bike and run. And that's a gap that ultimately I need to fill. There's some good research out there to rely on already. And then I have nutrition down here at the bottom, because to be able to do this, these series of events, we do need to pay close attention to nutrition and be able to, in order to complete the event as we want to. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these different areas of research in the next series of slides. Too tight of a wetsuit, just in a resting state, you have a tendency to have an increased blood pressure. We looked at both men and women. What was interesting though is this is not during exercise. And so what we don't know is what happens to blood pressure while you start exercising. From these studies, however, when I talk with triathletes, I tell them make sure to put your wetsuit on and to start moving around, and that might actually bring blood pressure back down to normal range. What's also interesting is even the higher blood pressure, that's not risky. Hypertension is 140 millimeters mercury. So this is, by putting a wetsuit on, there's no inherent risk by itself to a person. But if you're already hypertensive as an athlete and you wear too tight of a wetsuit, this might ultimately be a bit of a problem. All right, so then we also started doing some movement studies with the wetsuit, and something that triathletes say is that when we put on a full sleeve wetsuit, the picture on the left, that's harder to swim than a sleeveless wetsuit. And the sleeveless wetsuit is the one on the right, that's where there's no sleeves. And what athletes will often say is, well, if I put the sleeves on, it makes my shoulders sore, makes it harder to swim because there's more resistance to moving the arm. Well, there are no data on that, so what we did is we asked the question, what happens to muscle activity when you wear a full sleeve wetsuit versus no wetsuit, or a sleeveless wetsuit? So we did the experiment. We've actually done a couple of these experiments, and this is the citation down here that we're on. We have it submitted right now for publication. And these data are a summary of the study. On the y-axis for each of these plots is percent electromyography, which is just a measure of muscle activity. And on the x-axis are the different swim conditions. The average EMG up top and root mean square EMG on the bottom figure. And these are just different ways to quantify how active the muscle is. So we looked at how muscle activity over 5 swim cycles. And we had people swim without a wetsuit, the no wetsuit condition. We had them swim with a sleeveless wetsuit, no sleeves, and then have them swim with a full sleeve wetsuit. Interestingly, when we ran our statistics, there was no difference. And we looked at the anterior deltoid muscle, the first 3 bars, and then the posterior deltoid muscles. So anterior deltoid, posterior deltoid, to summarize the muscles in the shoulder. Interestingly, when we ran our statistics, there was no difference in muscle activity between these different conditions. So in that sense, the results from this experiment say it did not matter which wetsuit you wore, muscle activity was the same. However, you can start to see a trend with, especially the anterior deltoid muscle, that something seems to be happening there. So we're continuing to look at this, and we're actually going back and doing this experiment again, but now we're having subjects swim different speeds. And we're trying to swim faster in the wetsuits to see if maybe that difference starts to show up. So that's that iteration of research, is we've got these data, but we've noticed something's going on here, and we want to explore that a little bit further. For swimming, that's sort of the movement data that we looked at. This is the physiology that we're looking at. Looking at core temperature during swimming. To measure core temperature, what we're doing is we take a pill. I think I got a picture later on in it. We take a pill about the size of a vitamin, and we have people swallow the pill. It goes down into their stomach, and then starts to get digested into the gastrointestinal tract. And when it gets down into that area, we're able to measure core temperature. And so we're measuring core temperature telemetry through a telemetry system. And what we've started to do is look at what's happening to core temperature when swimming in different wetsuits. And we're interested in that because, one, we want to make sure that you stay warm during an event, but I'm mostly interested in what happens to core temperature when you're swimming in water that's too warm. Clearly, a wetsuit's going to help when the water's cold, but what happens when the water starts to creep up to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. What's 80 degrees Fahrenheit in Celsius? That would be about 25 degrees Celsius. So if you're swimming in 25 degrees Celsius, are you actually in any danger if you're swimming in a wetsuit? So we're looking at that. I have some colleagues that are looking at what happens to core temperature while swimming in cold temperatures, but I'm more interested in the warmer temperature. So here's some data from an experiment that we ran. On the y-axis is core temperature in Celsius, and then the x-axis are the wetsuit models. NW is the no wetsuit, SL is the sleeveless, and FS is the full sleeve wetsuit. And in this study, we had subjects swim 500 meters. And then we measured core temperature while swimming those 500 meters. We ran our statistics. Interestingly, no change in core temperature while swimming in either of the wetsuits compared to not wearing a wetsuit. So core temperature is sustained. That we found very odd, because the wetsuit, the whole idea is to retain the heat, and if we're swimming in warm temperature, we would think that that core temperature would go up, but that's not what we saw. So what we're starting to think now, is even that the brain is detecting what core temperature is and is not allowing the swimmer to swim too fast. If a swimmer is going to start swimming too fast, it's going to generate more heat. That heat would then be retained by the wetsuit, which would rise core temperature. So the instruction for this experiment were to have subjects swim at a comfortable pace. And by swimming at that comfortable pace, they may have picked a speed so that core temperature was not going to go up. So now we're redoing this experiment. We're having them, one, to swim longer, 1,000 meters, and then we're telling them to swim as fast as possible. And we're trying to see if core temperature will go up. Interestingly, the data that we have so far on that study, core temperature is still not going up. So we're having them swim faster, we're having them swim longer, but we're not seeing that core temperature go upward. What may actually be happening is the event still, and even 1,000 meters, just may not be long enough to impact core temperature. But this is an area that we're really interested in exploring, because it does come back to influencing even how you have rules for when you can wear wetsuit regarding the water temperature. Okay, so that's swimming. That's some swimming work that I've done. This is some data in looking at what happens when you exit the swim and you want to get to your bike, you transition. Well, now you have this wetsuit on. You've got to exit the water with the wetsuit. You've got to get on your bike, and you no longer have your wetsuit. So now you have to somehow get the wetsuit off. And you have to decide when to take the wetsuit off. Well, we actually looked at the physiological cost of transitioning from the swim to the bike. And we had people either run without a wetsuit, run carrying the wetsuit, run with the wetsuit all the way up, or run with the wetsuit halfway down. And we simply looked at VO2, rate of oxygen consumption, while running in these different conditions. So I'll go over this one quickly. VO2 on the y-axis, different conditions on the x-axis, no wetsuit, in hand, fully up, and then halfway down. Interestingly, running with the wetsuit halfway down, it's hard to see here, it's very subtle, was slightly greater than running without a wetsuit. So from these data, the best way to actually run was wearing the wetsuit fully up in terms of rate of oxygen consumption. So, taking the swim and transition research together, those are just the different citations. These are the applied take-home points from this research. One, select a wetsuit that's not too tight. Select a wetsuit based upon water temperature. Make sure the wetsuit fit does not interfere with shoulder movements, and then practice swimming in the wetsuit. So that's taking our empirical data and then coming up with some application to be able to improve swim performance during triathlon. Now we switch over to biking. All right, biking, the research that we're doing right now is we're looking at how much resistance there is to rolling the bike. And you get that resistance from the tires. So if we have a tire that's really wide, that's going to provide more resistance to rolling than something that's narrower. It's a general statement. Well, in cycling, we can buy all different types of tires, all different models, all different brands of tires, and we can buy different widths of tires, and we can pump up those tires to different pressures. So sometimes the tires are really soft, sometimes they're really hard. There's lots of pressure on the tires, or in the tires. Well, we're looking at what's the best tire to have the least resistance to rolling. So if I take a cyclist, I have a way now to measure that rolling resistance using some technology that we actually put on the bike. And these are data that we get that represents how much resistance there is to rolling a tire. And we want the least amount of rolling resistance, so that every time we push on the pedal, we're able to go as fast as possible. So what this graph is on the y-axis is a measure of that rolling resistance. The bigger that number, the more resistance there is to rolling. On the y-axis is how much pressure we put in the tire. So we can make the tire soft, or we can make it really hard by having lots of pressure in the tire. And then each one of those lines represents either a different width of wheel, like this is a wide wheel right here, or a narrow wheel. And then we put on different tires on each of those wheels. And then we run this experiment and we measure rolling resistance. And from this experiment, by putting different instruments on the bike, for this wheel and for this tire, we're able to identify the pressure that would have the least amount of rolling resistance. The least amount of rolling resistance here, or the least amount of rolling resistance for this wheel and tire combination. And so that becomes really useful information to me as a cyclist, because then I can pick the tire that has the least amount of rolling resistance, the width of that tire, as well as what pressure to put in that tire. And then I reduce that resistance as much as possible. So we've been doing some work on this, and actually when I get back from this trip, we're going to continue to collect some data where we're riding outside. All right, so now some physiology. So on bike research, some of the work that we're doing right now is we are doing a graded exercise test on a indoor bike and measuring a number of different things, including VO2, rate of oxygen consumption, lactate, heart rate, and cycling power or resistance. And by doing a graded exercise test, we're able to start identifying what pace a cyclist should be able to sustain. So this is just a typical graded exercise test. Down here is, that should be stage down here on the y-axis. Over here is VO2, which is the green line, the red line, VCO2, which is the green line, and the blue line is power or resistance in the cycling. So this is the graded part of the test. So it gets harder and harder with every minute of exercise, and we're measuring rate of oxygen consumption. By doing that type of work, we're able to start identifying what threshold a cyclist should be able to sustain for a long period of time. And then we can monitor that during training as well as during an event to be able to make sure that the person's able to complete the event as best as possible. The other part that we're doing, we're working on, is looking at lactate. So the other part of physiology, if we look at lactate, we're able to start identifying how much anaerobic conversion of carbohydrate there is to create mechanical energy or contract the muscle. So these are data of blood lactate during the same graded exercise test. Now we put intensity of cycling down here on this axis, blood lactate on the y-axis, and this is very characteristic data where we're pricking the finger and pulling out blood to to be able to analyze the amount of lactate, and we're able to see where the lactate starts to take off at what intensity. And once we identify that anaerobic threshold or lactate threshold or turn point, we're able to identify an intensity of exercise that we should be able to sustain for a long period of time. So then I can take these data and I can start to apply it to a cyclist race program to be able to have that person complete the distance, the bike distance, as short a period of time as possible. All right, so from our bike research data, just a couple different topics. We're able to make some applications, some recommendation. We want to select a tire-wheel combination that results in the lowest rolling resistance. We want to select a tire pressure that results in the lowest rolling resistance, and select an intensity that can be sustained for a long period of time. If we miss on our intensity, we exercise too hard, we're not going to be able to complete the entire triathlon in the best time possible. All right, so that takes us to the run research that we're doing. This is actually, we've been doing a lot of work on run shoes. That's been a big area of our research, and then also running style. And I'll talk a little bit about this study here, which actually I did with my son, who's doing his graduate work now in exercise science. In running shoes, there's the last 5 years or so, there has been a movement to create a shoe that has more cushioning. Prior to that, there was a movement to have runners run in bare feet. But it's more common now to actually have people running in what we call extreme cushioning or maximum cushioning shoes. Well, early when these shoes started to come out, the anecdotes, the stories were that it was too hard to run in the shoes because they're too soft. Well, we actually asked that question and conducted an experiment where we looked at rate of oxygen consumption while wearing a maximum cushioning shoe versus a normal training shoe. And we had subjects run at their preferred speed, the PS, and then we had them run faster, the PS plus, or slower, preferred speed minus, and we measured rate of oxygen consumption while wearing either the control shoe, the clear bar, or the maximum cushioning shoe. Now, the asterisk here is VO2 increased with speed, which is very characteristic. We know that to be true. But there is no difference in VO2 at each of the speeds between the shoes. So the rate of oxygen consumption was the same. And so what we were able to identify is that by wearing a maximum cushioning shoe, you did not negatively influence rate of oxygen consumption. And so that was an important message out of this project. The other area that we've done a lot of work in is looking at what happens when you have people run the way they want to run, and then when you ask them to run in an entirely different way. So this is a very common experiment to do, and this is some interesting data. What we do is we have people come in and run on the treadmill. We measure VO2, and then we measure their preferred stride rate, just the rate or the cadence that they want to select and they naturally select. And we know that if we get up and run outside, you just naturally select a cadence that, that you want to run at. Then what we do is we have people run with a faster cadence, they run the same speed, and then have them run at a slower cadence, same speed. In this experiment, which really was an important one, we did that experiment for 3 different speeds. So we had people come in and run at 3.13 meters per second, had them run the way they want to run, and then we had them run with a faster stride frequency or slower stride frequency. And then we repeated that experiment at a faster velocity and then a faster velocity. And then I have VO2 on the y-axis and then percent stride frequency on the x-axis. What's interesting is when you start having people run in a way that they don't normally want to run, VO2 tends to go up. It doesn't always go up, but it tends to go up. In this case, we did not see a dramatic change in VO2 despite the changes in the stride frequency that we looked at. What's interesting is we were actually trying to get them to run under 15 strides per minute, steps per minute, or excuse me, 115% of their stride frequency, but they only achieved about 10, maybe 12% faster stride frequency. And that's something to keep in mind, that as you start asking people to change the way they want to run, they keep trying to come back to their preferred condition. And it's very hard to actually get them to run in a different way. But what was also interesting from these data is that as we ran faster, that difference in VO2 tended to get smaller between the different stride frequency conditions. The reason is that as we started to run faster and people were changing their stride frequency, this is only representing the aerobic conversion of chemical energy to mechanical energy. What I missed in this experiment was the anaerobic conversion of chemical energy to mechanical energy. If I go back and do this experiment again, I'll look at the anaerobic contribution to running, and I would suspect that's actually going to be much greater as we start changing stride frequency. But from this, we were able to identify and confirm some data that were out there already, that we tend to select a stride rate that is the least amount of cost to energy, but you also have some changes in stride frequency that you can make that do not have any dramatic changes in VO2. Here, this one here, this data point is 36 mLs per kg per minute versus 35 mLs per kg per minute. That's not a big change. So you actually have some room to change stride frequency and not negatively influence VO2. But what we don't know, and this is something I'm really interested in, is what happens to this relationship at the beginning of a marathon, the middle of a marathon, or the end part of a marathon. I put this picture in here. You think it's a picture of this person right here. This is the end of Ironman Boulder, and it looks like this is a nice picture of this person running. But that's not actually the picture I'm interested in. I'm interested in this person right here. That's me at the end of a marathon where I was hunched over, just extremely tired. And I would be really interested to see, I am interested to see what happens to stride frequency during the course of an Ironman like this. All right. So we don't have those data. And so this is something that ultimately I do want to do. All right, some other run research. This is the application of the run research. These are just a couple of studies here that I've gone through. And the recommendations from the work that we've done: use a shoe that's most comfortable and allow stride frequency to change with speed. These are actually some data of stride frequency at different speeds, and we know stride frequency changes, and it is most important to allow someone to pick their own stride frequency as they're running these different speeds. And something I'm interested in now, especially with the Nike 4% shoes, Hoka shoes, these have carbon fiber plates in them. There's a big change in shoe technology, and I'm interested to see how those shoes ultimately may influence some of these recommendations that we're making for runners. All right, so I put this slide in here because although I don't talk about body weight support here, I want to let you know that you have an expert, probably the singular most well-published person in body weight support research, and that's in Dr. Matsumoto. He has done a tremendous amount of work on body weight support. It's been a pleasure collaborating with him from the time that he came and did his postdoc with me at UNLV, and we've continued to work on a variety of projects. And this type of work, although I don't have it in this presentation, is important for when subjects get injured. We know that people who participate and train in endurance performance, they are at a high risk of overuse injuries. And the work that we've done together has been important for me in giving application and advice to endurance athletes. So I often will get emails or messages about someone who has plantar fasciitis or iliotibial tendonitis, or they pulled a muscle, or they have a sore back or something like that, and they say, what can we do? And I say, run in the water, or run with body weight support, so they can come down to my lab and use the body weight support treadmill. And then they say, well, how do I use running in the water? And I tell them of our research that if they're going to do running in the water, they need to exercise at a higher intensity than what they would normally pick on land and do short intervals. Or if they're able to come to the lab, I tell them that they can run with body weight support, and their running pattern will look very similar to what their normal pattern would look like. It's just less stressful. And we've done a lot of work where we looked at how stressed the muscles are or how much VO2 there is, and we're able, but through body weight support, to be able to minimize that stress, but allow them to still use the running pattern to still train the coordination of muscles, and that is important when you're rehabilitating from an injury. So this is a very important work, and very important to know that you have an expert in this area in Dr. Matsumoto. So now I want to take all those, and I want to even dial the research down to even something more important. And that importance is, how do I go faster? That's what I'm interested in. I don't want Dr. Matsumoto to go faster. I want to be able to go faster than Dr. Matsumoto. So now how do I take this research that we've done and start to help me complete an iron distance event faster? That seems selfish, but that's why I got into this whole area to begin with, is I wanted to be able to go faster as a triathlete. Something that's really important to keep in mind when you read research and when you do research is a lot of our research is what we call group design. We study 10 people, we study 20 people, whatever, and we average those people together. And then we do our statistics. And that's an important design that we want to keep in mind. But ultimately, what I'm interested in is, how do I respond? How do I respond to a particular shoe, or a particular wetsuit, or a particular bike, or what have you? And so I put up, these are just made up data. This is some parameter on the y-axis, and these are different subjects down here. And in my group design, I would average all these subjects together. And I would say, this is the average response. This group of subjects had an average of 10. And then I could compare this average response to either another group or maybe another condition. What might get missed is how unique this subject is. And so that subject, that may be me, or that may be Dr. Matsumoto, or maybe you. And so something to keep in mind when we read our research is that often our individual responses are lost. And so when we start taking data from experiments and start to apply them, we have to keep in mind that I may respond differently than a group. And that's not always easy to make that jump from our empirical data to then trying to give practical advice to individuals, or to make a plan to complete an event. So I'm going to give you an example, and this is the last event that I did. I'm setting up for Ironman Arizona, 2.4 mile swim, roughly 4,000 meters swim, 112 mile bike, and 26.2 mile run, so 180K and 42K as well. So this is all the race that I had planned. Obviously I did a lot of training for it, but ultimately I wanted to create a plan to be able to do this as fast as possible. So although I haven't talked too much about nutrition, nutrition is a big part of this. We need to figure out the energetic cost to do each of these events. So here I've taken the swim, the bike, the run, and I've looked at the estimated calories based upon research. And these were all from calorie calculators, based upon my weight, based upon the speed that I would go. It probably would take, estimate the group design, probably about 850 calories to do the swim, about 2,500 calories to do the bike, and about 3,500 calories to do the run. or almost 7,000 calories total. That's based upon an estimate of group design. This is actually some data that I've measured during different events. Where do I get the data from? Typically wearing a Garmin watch that has wearable technology that also communicates with a heart rate monitor that's then used to calculate, still it's an estimate, but bring a little bit more specific to me. And so looking back over different races, I probably used about 900 to 1,000 calories during this swim. So pretty close to the group. So I'm probably pretty typical. 3,300 to 3,700 calories on the bike, far more than the group. So this is more specific to me. 2,250, 2,500 calories, probably less on the run. So probably that range of calories. So dialing in a little bit more about me as an individual versus the group design. I use those data to then calculate how many calories per hour I need to be able to take in during an event. So now I'm trying to create a nutrition plan in order to have the right amount of chemical energy available to be able to complete the event. All right, so what's also important to know is we have a lot of stored energy in us. I have all this fat on me. In fact, if I do my body composition is about 10%. This is just some data from Tim Noakes' book, The Lower Running, using a 15% body fat person. That's stored energy. There's a lot of chemical energy. In fact, if we look at someone who's 180 pounds, 80 kilograms, and we looked at 15% body fat, they have 63,000 calories stored. That's a lot. I only need 7,000. But there's 63,000 calories stored in my body in terms of fat. Carbohydrate, I've got carbohydrate in my muscle, I've got carbohydrate in my liver, I've got probably about 250 grams of calories stored, 250 grams of carbohydrate stored, which is about 1,000 calories. So I've got plenty of stored energy in the body to be able to complete this event. Plenty of fuel. So it's like having a full tank of gas. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that in order to use, and you know your physiology, and this is just different pathways to generate ATP, in order to generate ATP using fats, I need a little bit of carbohydrate. I need a little bit of carbohydrate. So we say carbohydrate, fats burn in the carbohydrate flame. That is, we need some carbohydrate in order to break fat down and be able to get the ATP, the energy stored from that chemical energy. So what's the solution? Well, I've got to take in some carbohydrate, but ultimately I want to try to tap into the fat as the fuel. So what we do is from a nutrition perspective, is we identify a nutrition plan based upon the energetic cost that it's going to take to complete this event. So we figure out what we're going to have for breakfast. We figure out, well, these are 2 breakfasts. So one 4 hours before the start, because we want to allow for some digestion to occur. Then another breakfast about an hour before the event. We're going to take in some nutrition during a bike. Here about 1,000 calories. This is also a bike. This is more of a solid form. This is more liquid form. Actually, there's more solid. And then what to do on the run to try to take in as much calories as we can. But we know that we can only digest calories so much at a particular rate. We can't digest, and we know that. If we have a big meal, we get very tired afterwards because it's too hard to digest all those calories that we take in at any particular point. In fact, what we have to do is really figure out how many calories per hour we can digest. And this, 900 calories per hour, I can't take in 900 calories and digest that. I can't. 600 calories is too much. I can't get those calories in fast enough to allow the digestive system to be able to get the macronutrients to a point where we're getting ATP from them. But I can try to generate a plan to get a reasonable amount of calories in, but then still use the stored calories that I have. Okay. So the whole idea is to take chemical energy use our stored chemical energy and convert that to mechanical energy. And when we do that, as I said, we're only about 30 to 33% efficient. The rest of that energy is going off as heat. So we have, at times we have races that we want to retain the heat if it's a cold event, and sometimes we want to dissipate the heat. When I came in 2009, I wanted to dissipate the heat because it was a hot race, very humid race. But in Arizona, this is something that we do, is we start looking at the temperatures that the race will be held at, to then try to figure out, do we want to retain the heat that we're generating, or do we want to get rid of the heat? Hopefully you see where this is going, because I'm interested in core temperature during these events. So this is just from the weather app, and just looking at humidity, looking at temperature, and even looking at wind as we go along. And for race day, it was going to be 21 degrees Celsius, which is a very comfortable race. I had to figure out what sweat rate was, because ultimately we want to figure out how much hydration to take in during the course of an event. Because if we're trying to manage thermal regulation, we know that one way we do that is by sweating, if we're trying to get rid of heat. And so we do need to monitor how much fluid we're losing during the course of an event. And once we identified that, we can start identifying how much hydration to take in during an event. And I'm going to skip over a little bit of the details on this, but this is just looking at how much, or trying to plan out, based upon the temperature, how much fluid to take in during the course of the event. And I say as tolerated here, because if we take a lot of fluid in, it's hard to exercise. So we don't want to have too much fluid. So here's some, swim pacing, I'm going backwards here. So another part that we're interested in when we're planning out an event is to make sure that we identify the right intensity to be able to complete the event. So I've got swim intensity here, and these are just some data from our wearable technology, our Garmin watch, my Garmin watch, to be able to look at the pace, look at heart rate, and look at the stroke rate during the course of the swim. In this case, the water temperature was going to be 16.6 degrees Celsius, so I considered wearing a thermal cap to be able to retain the heat during the swim, and also wear a thermal wetsuit to try to retain as much of the heat as possible during the swim and not get cold. Intensity from a run plan perspective, what we have to do is account for elevation changes during the race to be able to identify a pace, ultimately identify a heart rate that we want to be able to use to sustain that pace, and then here's some run metric data here. These are some data from an unsuccessful run during a marathon, and something that's important to recognize is that in this marathon, there's a period of time, these are data from me, where it was not moving, and that's because I was having problems with my stomach. In fact, if I look at all those little breaks, those were all times that I was not moving, and I had the wrong intensity plan for the run. And so what we're ultimately trying to do is create the right plan in order to be able to run the entire race. I'll show you some data in just a second. So is this a fitness problem, is it a nutrition problem, or is there something else that's going on? So for Arizona, I took all those pieces of information, I created a plan to be able to swim, bike, and run at certain intensities to be able to complete as fast as possible. And then I measured core temperature during the race. I measured blood glucose by using a continuous blood glucose monitor. I stuck this little device right on the side of my trunk. I measured heart rate, stroke rate, bike power, and run cadence during the event to evaluate the plan. Here are some data. I'll present this, and I think I'll end pretty soon on this. Down here is the is time of day on the x-axis. On the y-axis is a variety of different things. This is the beginning of the swim. This is the end of the swim, beginning of the bike. This is the end of the bike, beginning of the run, and the end of the race here. I've got different data here. In blue, that's core temperature. The red is heart rate, and the orange is blood glucose. And so what I'm interested in is making sure that my blood glucose levels do not drop, nor do they go too high. Because what's happening is the liver is releasing glucose into the blood, that's being delivered to the muscle, and then the muscle is using that glucose for either energy or to keep sustaining the use of fat as fuel. So fortunately, we have the ability to monitor this. And I can start looking at what happens with blood glucose. This is right before waking up. Blood glucose level goes quite low during sleep. And then I have breakfast. I had breakfast back here. Swimming, blood glucose levels sustained up until this, and I can't actually explain why blood glucose increased getting on the bike, but on the bike ride, my blood glucose levels were relatively stable. This is probably when I'm taking in some fuel, and blood glucose level goes up. It starts to drop during the run, and then at the end of the run, it starts to go up, and then I finish, and it goes back down. Right here is where I had the most amount of carbohydrate. I had some soda, and my blood glucose spiked at that point. Heart rate, pretty sustained during the bike ride. During the run, heart rate started high, and then it dropped down. And you'll see in a second, my pace actually was slowing. And then core temperature, it went down initially on the swim. Then by exercising in the water, it became more sustained, dropped, exiting the water, and then sustained during the bike ride. I had a spike in core temperature here, that's where I was running the fastest, and then core temperature dropped, and then it came back up near the end where I was trying to run faster as well. I'm going to add some data here. This is cadence. This is swim cadence, run cadence, or it's going to be bike cadence, and then run cadence here as well. What I'm trying to do is figure out how to complete this event in as short of a period of time, and I'm going back and I'm looking at my cadence, I'm looking at my blood glucose, my nutrition, I'm looking at my physiology, my heart rate, my core temperature, to be able to design a plan based upon empirical evidence, the research that we're doing, but then also understanding how I as an individual respond. And if I continue to do this, I'm hoping to be more successful. This is the end of Arizona. I was able to feel like I was running fast. I was not running very fast at this point, and quite tired at the end, but felt like that was a victory. So by taking a lot of different research, by applying the scientific method, I can come up with an application for a plan to try to go faster, and hopefully by evaluating that plan for an individual, start determining an even better way to complete the event to be able to be as successful as possible. This is all structured around this model of asking questions, measuring things, evaluating the measurements, and asking more questions or different questions. I have lots of people to thank, lots of students, colleagues, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you folks. So thank you. I hope this was interesting.